Hey, it's Jeff. Welcome back to another video. Today I'm going to be showing you the best method for propagating Hoya cuttings, and this is obviously in my experience. I know there's a few different methods out there, one being water. Another one is sphagnum moss, which is extremely popular and usually very successful, but I don't like using it just because once the moss gets entangled in the very fine, thin Hoya roots, it's usually tough to get off without damaging the root system. And then another method is just straight soil propagation, which it doesn't usually hold the greatest results for successful propagations. So the method that I like to use, which holds really good results as well as super healthy roots, is the Perlite prop box. So here is my prop box. It's just a clear Tupperware container from the dollar store. It's filled about 1/3 with perlite, and I have a few different cuttings in here. I have been rooting these Hoya polynera for about maybe 3 weeks or so. I have a Syngonium chia pens and a Cebu blue pothos. I have really good success with basically every type of plant that I put in here. I think I've maybe only lost 1 or 2 cuttings from Hoyas in the past, so I'd probably give it like a 99% success rate. It just does super well in these perlite prop boxes. So I do have a video on how to set it up in detail. I'll leave it up in the top corner here, but basically I will fill this container with perlite and then I will just basically soak it and then drain the water out so that there is no like pooling of water at the bottom, and you want it so that the perlite just remains a little bit damp. So if you squish it, you should be able to feel and see a little bit of moisture on your hand. So the perlite stays wet. If it gets dry, then you just take like a misting bottle or a spray bottle and just, I guess, rehydrate the perlite. And I always keep my perlite prop box lid on. I will maybe open it once a week or once every 2 weeks. I don't have any holes on the top or anything like that. I have never had any cuttings, Hoya cuttings, rot in this perlite prop box, and I do have it close to a south-facing window. I just have it on a floor about 3 feet back, so it gets a lot of light. Nothing direct so that it scorches the cuttings or anything like that, but it just does really, really well. And I'm going to show you the roots on these Hoya polynera cuttings. Beautiful roots. And the reason why I like using perlite over any other propagating medium is that when you go to transition these to soil, like look how thin these roots are. When you transition them to soil, I find that perlite doesn't have that transition shock. So basically you can pot them up in some soil and you don't really have to adjust the, I guess, normal care for a Hoya because it's been in perlite. Like, look at this. They're pretty thick and they're not delicate like water roots. I just have a container of a bunch of different plants in water right now, but when you go to transition this from water to soil, sometimes these roots have a difficult time going from a nice well-watered environment to a very dense growing medium. Sometimes the roots have a little bit of a difficult time adjusting to the soil. It's just a lot more dense. I find that doesn't happen when you have a plant propagating in perlite and then you just put it in soil. Basically, I provided the same care, so there's no increased watering or anything needed. It's just you pot it up in some soil. I will water it thoroughly until it comes out the bottom of the drain hole, and then I'll just treat it like I normally would. So you'll let the soil dry out and just continue on with its regular care. Whereas if you have a water propagated cutting and you put it in soil, you might have to keep that soil a little bit more on the wet or damp side for about 2 weeks, just because you don't want those water roots drying out. Otherwise it'll end up getting root rot. You can get root rot from underwatering or letting those roots get dry. So, or even if you keep it too wet, then you can develop root rot that way. So I find it's a little bit more delicate when you have a plant in water and put it in soil, whereas I find you don't have that difficulty with perlite into soil. You can see all these cuttings have nice roots. You can have a propagation container with sphagnum moss as well, but I find if you don't get all the moss off of the roots, and then you put it in soil and it's not a really like chunky aroid mix like with lots of orchid bark or that sort of thing. If you just put it in straight soil with sphagnum moss, it tends to hold on to moisture a lot more than the perlite, so you might end up with some root rot if you don't get the sphagnum moss entirely off the roots. And when you do that, you can see that some of these smaller cuttings have really small, delicate roots. So if you're tugging away at sphagnum moss, these roots are pretty much the same size as what a sphagnum moss root, I guess, looks like, or strand. So you might end up just pulling some of these roots off and stressing out the plant a little bit. So when I have perlite on the roots like this, I'll just try and knock it off as best as I can, but I will definitely plant this in soil with this amount of perlite on the roots. I find it doesn't hold on to moisture as much as the sphagnum moss. So that's why I love using these prop boxes, these perlite prop boxes with many different types of cuttings. Like I said, here's a Syngonium chiapense. It's only been in here for a couple of weeks. This was just basically a wet stick. It's got some nice roots on there and it's already getting a new growth point. So really successful for many different plants. And again, you're only limited to the size of the box. So if you have a more expensive plant, I don't know, like any anthuriums or philodendrons or anything like that, if you get a taller prop box, then you can do the same thing with larger cuttings. Just basically cover the bottom with some perlite, enough to cover any of the aerial roots or nodes, and then just cover it up like you'd normally would. And I guess the key thing to this is having a clear lid. You don't want something that will not allow sunlight in, so make sure you have a clear lid, clear box. But it doesn't really matter about the size of the box. So I'm going to be now potting some of these cuttings up into soil, and then I'll basically show that process. Oh, I forgot for soil. I've done soil propagation, just like these cuttings. Like I have a couple of these Hoya carnosa cuttings. I have just literally stuck them in soil, and usually, or I guess in my experience, I haven't had a very good success rate because these cuttings will usually dry up or rot before it establishes any roots. Whereas if you have the perlite prop box, you can see on the sides, there's a lot of condensation. So it holds in some humidity. Here, I don't know why I covered it, but you can see there's some condensation on the side. So it's a really high humid environment. It's warm, it keeps in the heat. That's what the roots and the plant like. I have done water with really good success, but again, it's just that transition period that's a little bit tricky. And I've never propagated in sphagnum. Actually, I shouldn't say that. I did do experiment. I've gotten many Hoyas in sphagnum moss, but it's just a nightmare to get those off. So my preferred method, really high success rate, really easy transition period. It's super simple, by far the best method for propagating Hoyas. Here is a pot of Hoya polyneura that I potted in some soil, I want to say maybe a couple months ago. I think there was probably, it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe 4 or 5 cuttings. Here's where I've made the previous prune. You can see it's now gotten an entirely new stem. Looks like 2 nodes. Here's another one back here. It's now getting some cute little leaves. They've all started to branch out. So this is how you get, I guess, a fuller pot of Hoya from just single leaf cuttings. I'm going to take all these cuttings out of the perlite as I'll pot them up in some soil, and then I'm going to be adding these just straight green carnosa cuttings. So here's a single section, and you just stick it down in the perlite, just like that. I try and keep the leaves off of any type of growing medium just because I don't want them to rot. And you just literally stick it down in the perlite, make sure the stem is covered, and in about 2 weeks you should have some root development there. So I find it roots a lot faster in these prop boxes. With the exception of this larger cutting, they're all fairly small. So what I'm going to do is put some soil in this container here first, just like that. I'm going to add the larger cutting just so that the first set of leaves here are not or will not be underneath the soil. So I might just set it in the middle like this, and then I'm going to add some soil just on the sides, kind of cover this guy up, and then I'll add these single leaf cuttings. Oops, this one's popping out. I'll add these single leaf cuttings just around the pot here, just something like this, just lightly push it down into the soil. Just using like a tropical plant mix with a little bit of, looks like leftover orchid bark from an aroid mix. Just plunk these down. Doesn't have to be anything special, just something like this. And then I'll cover the remaining roots with soil. So this will be a well-draining mix. Hoyas don't like to sit in kind of wet, soggy soil for very long. Just like with most like tropical houseplants, They like to be well watered, but they don't like to sit in like really soggy wet soil for a long time, otherwise they'll develop some root rot. Just give it a little bit of a shake. This root is sticking out, so I'm just going to push that down. So I got 2 cuttings there, one here and then the larger one kind of in the middle. And then I'm going to get my spray bottle and kind of wet the soil and clean off these leaves. Just going to let that drain through. Clean off the leaves, everything looks good. Just let that drain through the drain holes there at the bottom. I normally don't water in my little soil tray here, but I don't have a little drip tray or anything right now. So I think that's for me pretty much it for this video. If you have any comments or questions, please leave it down below in the comment section. Let me know your best method of rooting Hoyas or what you prefer. Thanks again for watching my videos. Take care, everyone. Bye.